Half square triangles, they can be so pretty and so versatile, but if you need a lot of them and you're anything like me, you can be pulling your hair out trying to make a lot. So I have a great tutorial for you today. I have the 32 at a time half square triangle making method that we're going to go through together. So if you need a lot of half square triangles of the same print, then this would be a great option for you. There are pros and cons to using this method. Obviously, the one pro is that you end up with 32 half square triangles in a minimal amount of time. One of the major negatives to this method is that you need to start with a larger fabric square to be able to do this method and get the 32 half square triangles out of your two fabrics. But if you have those larger pieces of fabric, then this might be a great solution for you. Plus, it's just fun because look, now we have all these beautiful half square triangles that are just ready for a project. So if you'd like to find out more, then stick with me and we'll go through this tutorial. And also, if you like this type of tutorial, do me a favor and subscribe to my channel, and then you'll be notified every time I post free tutorials and tips like these, or even my free patterns. So let's get started with our 32 at a time half square triangle method. So let's get our tools together for making our 32 at a time half square triangles. You'll need a quilting ruler, and it doesn't matter what brand or anything. You'll need a marking pen or pencil, and then your usual sewing supplies, sewing machine, thread, rotary cutter, and rotary cutting mat. So let's get started. Similar to other half square triangle making methods, we are going to be marking on the wrong side of our fabric. So I have my two fabric squares that I'm going to be making my 32 at a time half square triangles. So I will take the lighter color and place that face down on my work surface. And then we'll need our ruler. And the first thing that we want to do is draw a center line in both directions on our fabric square. So you'll need to find the middle and draw a line. My fabric square is 13 inches, so my halfway point will be 6.5. And just make sure that you are keeping your line straight here before you draw that line, and then we'll draw our line. And then we'll do the same thing in the other direction. Okay, there we have our two center lines. Our next step will be to draw from each diagonal, corner to corner. So we'll have two diagonal lines going across our block. You'll want to make sure that your diagonal lines are also crossing that center line as well. And there we go. We have our two center lines and two diagonal lines drawn on our fabric. And sometimes with this method, it helps me to think about this in quadrants. If you think about having 1, 2, 3, 4 quadrants of your block, then sometimes it's a bit easier as we're working through this process to think about how these half square triangles will take shape. And so with the quadrant idea in mind, we need to draw a diagonal line in this area from point to point in our quadrant 1. We'll do the same in quadrant 2 from diagonal to diagonal, in quadrant 3 diagonal to diagonal, and 4 diagonal to diagonal. So let me show you. Take our ruler and we're going to start with quadrant 1, and I need to turn my fabric just a little bit so it's easier for me to get this set up. And we're drawing from the edges of the fabric, but it's essentially right where that line is ending at the end of our fabric. And then also I like to pay attention and make sure that my diagonal line is lined up here, and then we'll draw the line. And there we go. And that is quadrant 1. You don't need to remember them numbered. It's just like I mentioned that it helps my brain sometimes to think about things in smaller pieces so I don't get overwhelmed trying to remember anything. And then we're going to do that with each quadrant. Okay, so now you can see we have a lot of drawn lines on our fabric, but we're not going to let that distract us, are we? So at this point, we want to take our other fabric square and we're going to place these right sides together, lining up the edges. So I like to pin these because this is a large piece of fabric that we're going to be moving around on our sewing machine, sewing in different directions. And so just find the best place for you to pin. What I like to do is pin in the middle areas where I know I will not need to move the pins as I'm sewing. And this helps keep the fabric square together and avoid shifting as you're moving it, because we're going to be sewing again in so many different directions. So I just like to place pins in these areas. If it helps you to pin in areas near the lines, that's completely fine. You'll just need to remember to move those as you're sewing. Okay, and there we go. I really just pinned in the center. I haven't pinned in the outside edges because it's really being held together with those pins. I will add one pin in the center though, and I will need to remove that after my first set of sewing. If you've made half square triangles with drawn lines before in the past, like with the 2 at a time method or the 8 at a time method, then you may be tempted to take this over to the sewing machine and begin sewing in all directions around your drawn lines, but we're not going to do that with a 32 at a time method. It is very important that you do not sew on the sides of the center lines. So this line horizontal and this line vertical, do not sew on those lines. Those will be cutting lines for us later. But you will be sewing on all of the diagonal lines. We have them going across the block and then in each quadrant. So we'll sew 1/4 of an inch on both sides of all of our diagonal lines. Again, remember, do not sew on your center lines, the vertical and the horizontal. So let's take this over to the sewing machine and get started. Okay, here we are at my sewing machine, and again, we are going to sew 1/4 of an inch on either side of all of the drawn diagonal lines, not down the center vertical and horizontal lines. So what I like to do is start with this horizontal line, because then I can actually just make my way across the entire block, and then I'll sew the remainder. And you will notice that in these areas you will have multiple sewing lines that will intersect each other, and that's perfectly fine. And you'll notice that I actually like to sew off my block and then reposition, and then I'm not cutting my threads, and then I just continue sewing. Okay, I am back from the sewing machine, and you can see I have sewn lines on all of my diagonals. And again, I know I've already said it, but we did not sew on the center horizontal and vertical line. Those are going to be a cutting line. I'll go ahead and remove my pins because they're no longer needed. And now the magic begins. So I mentioned before that it's easier to think about our large square in 4 smaller quadrants. And now we're actually going to put that into practice physically, and it'll make this process much easier. So your first step will be to cut along your center drawn lines. Remember, those were the lines that we did not sew on. They were cutting lines. Line up our ruler and cut. We'll do the same in the other direction. And now watch how much easier this is to think about. We have our 4 quadrants now. And if you're familiar with the 8 at a time method, that's exactly what we're going to do with each of these quadrants. So what I'll do, I'm going to put these 3 to the side, and I'll concentrate on this one first. And thinking about it this way just makes it so much more manageable, not only mentally to make sure you don't make any mistakes, but then also just your space. You're working with a larger square of fabric with this method, but breaking it down into 4 smaller sections is so much easier. Another tool that will make this much easier too is a rotating cutting mat. I have a Martelli Notions cutting mat, and so we'll just place our square there. And you can see now we're working with a smaller square, smaller surface area, and then also I've got my smaller ruler. So the first thing we want to do is cut down the center of this individual block. And then we don't want to disturb the block when we make those 2 cuts. And then I'll show you how we make the process even easier as we work down. So we want to line up. I like to line up along the bottom and the sides, but then also make sure that you are hitting that center point and cut. Gently picking up your ruler, rotating your cutting mat. If you don't have a rotating cutting mat, you can actually just pick up your cutting mat and rotate it without moving the fabric. It makes things much easier rather than picking up your fabric and trying to realign everything. Lining everything up and making the next center cut. Now look how we're working this down even more. Now we have 4 additional pieces, and what do we have now? We have a simple 2 at a time half square triangle. Isn't that great? So as I mentioned, we're working this down into smaller sections, so it's just so much easier to think about as we're cutting. So now all we need to do is cut along the drawn line of each of our squares. Okay, so we're all done. And now we have 8 half square triangles, but remember this was just quadrant 1. We have our other 3 quadrants that we'll do the exact same thing with to have 32 half square triangles. Okay, and now I'm finished, and look at this, how quick this was to make 32 half square triangles. So this is a great method to use when you need a lot of half square triangles. Now I'm going to get these pressed and I'll meet you back over here. I am back from the pressing station and I have trimmed my blocks, and look at all of these beautiful half square triangles. 32 of them that we made. Can you believe it? So if you have a project where you need a lot of half square triangles in the same prints, then this is a great method. The one major drawback to this method is that you need a larger piece of fabric, but if you have yardage available and you're not using smaller squares, then it's a great option. If you need help with some of the quilty math to decide what size your beginning square should be to end with a certain unfinished or finished size of half square triangle, down in the description below, I've linked my Ultimate Half Square Triangle Guide. It's a free guide that I have on my blog that tells you the quilty math if you want to calculate it yourself, or I've also given you a few examples so you don't have to do all of the work. So I'm curious, drop me a comment below. Tell me what you thought of this method. Do you like this and think that you're going to use it in a project? I'd love to hear from you. And also, if you liked this tutorial and would like more, do me a favor and give me a thumbs up and like this video so I can keep creating free content for you like this. So again, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial on making 32 at a time half square triangles. So happy sewing, and I'll see you next time.